Now that we have our skeleton animating, you should be able to play your animation and see the hitbox. Now, very similar to what happened with our sword is we need to make sure that when the game starts, our hitbox is disabled. And the animation is what's going to actually be responsible for enabling it. So to do that, you want to make sure that isTrigger is checked, Box Collider 2D is off, so make sure that you can't see it in the scene view. And from here, we're going to re-record, get into record mode, make sure you're on your attack animation, and on the first frame, we're going to say enable the Box Collider 2D. That's going to allow us to automatically enable it, detect our collisions, and be done. The next thing we have to do is we need to now tell it to ignore itself, because very similar to what happened with the player and the sword, it was attacking itself. We need to tell the hitbox to ignore the enemy, basically. So if we look at how, and let's get out of record mode here, and if we look at how the sword hitbox works, we have a layer called sword, and then here on the sprite, we have the player layer. So very similar, we'll create an enemy layer, and then we'll have a sword layer. So here, let's see here. So we have our sprite, skeleton enemy. So let's create a new layer. And let's call this enemy. So user layer 11. So this is going to be enemy. And then user layer 12, let's go ahead and create one for the enemy attack. The reason why we don't want to use the player's sword is because I'm afraid that if we do that, the sword won't collide with not only our player, but it won't collide with the enemy, and that's not what we want. So we're going to have a separate layer for the enemies to ignore. So we have enemy, and then we have enemy attack. And we want these two layers to ignore each other. Alright, so now that we have those layers created, we're going to select our hitbox. We're going to assign it a layer of enemy attack. And we're going to select our sprite and assign it a layer of enemy. It's going to say yes, change children, that's fine. Also make sure you do it to the parent object. Yes, change children. And that's going to override the hitbox. So you need to reselect the layer in the enemy and change it to enemy attack. Save your scene. And the next thing we need to do is we need to go to Edit, Project Settings, Physics 2D. And very similar here, you'll see that the player, using the collision matrix here, it's ignoring the sword. Well, we need our enemy to ignore the enemy attack. So our enemy attack, and it looks like these layers are a little bit backwards, so let's go ahead and flip them. So hop back into our layers, edit layers, and let's make this enemy attack, just so we can keep it consistent with how we did it for our player. And enemy. Select your skeleton enemy. This is going to be the enemy. And then the hitbox is going to be the enemy attack. And we want those two layers to ignore each other. So save your scene, go to Edit, Project Settings, Physics 2D, and let's ignore that layer. So here we are on the enemy, attack, and you'll see here that we can say enemy attack is going to ignore the enemy. Or on the underneath the enemy here, you have enemy attack. Make sure you just uncheck that. That way these two layers will not communicate with each other. Very similar to how we did it with the sword. You have the player here, and he is ignoring the sword layer. Alright, so once you have that, go ahead and save this. And we are good to go with setting up our enemy attack in the next video.